Hi guys, welcome to another video. This time I'm going to start a little series about how and why I built my Hackintosh. Let's start with a little disclaimer up front. This is not a computer channel. I normally make photography videos here and sometimes also some music videos, but I used to repair computers for a living, so I'm not completely without a clue. Last year in September, I had a bit of a problem, which was that my two old MacBooks, like very old MacBooks in part, both broke, and they both failed due to cooling issues. One was an Intel MacBook Air from 2015 and the other was a MacBook Pro from 2009. Intel Macs run very hot, so after a while their logic boards start to warp because they get so hot. The MacBook Pro, which has one of the older processors, lasted quite a while, but that MacBook Air was already slightly broken after a year because it had such cooling issues. So after this experience with cooling problems, I was just not really prepared to buy another Intel Mac. This happened in September 2020, and Apple had just brought out lots of new machines with new processors and a new architecture that runs a lot cooler. So one would think that buying one of those would be the solution to my problems. But my real issues with the M1 Mac are mainly in compatibility problems. I still use a lot of third-party plugins in my music production, so some of them still have 32-bit necessities, and that's like 3 operating systems behind, and yeah, a new Mac, one of those M1 Macs, would be basically a very expensive paperweight for me. I needed an Intel Mac, also because I wanted to get into 3D animation a little more with Blender, and for that I needed a Mac that runs Windows 2. I never had any Windows on my Macs except in Parallels for the last 15 years, but I really wanted to try it out because Blender just doesn't run very well under macOS. So there were 2 reasons now that I wanted to go the Hackintosh route. Other people who don't use much third-party software like that probably won't have a problem with M1 Macs, and I think they're really cool machines and it's really nice, interesting architecture. I think just that I'm not quite ready for it yet. So if you're in my situation where the Intel Macs just run way too hot for what you do and the M1 Macs are not quite ready yet, then Hackintosh is actually a really good option. Granted, it takes a lot of research and it's a lot of hassle sometimes. Installing it is not easy, and I used to repair computers for a living, so I have a bit of an advantage in that respect. So if you're not really knowledgeable about computers, you will have to be prepared to do a lot of research to get this done. I do believe, however, that everyone can get it done because the resources nowadays are really good. There are several channels that make it really simple and have step-by-step guides on how to install it. There are even people who offer tech support for Hackintoshing. There are also many forums where if you have done your research beforehand and ask good questions, they will help you sort out your problems. I think Hackintoshing is a good option also to learn about computers. So if you always wanted to know how they work but weren't really interested in Windows and going that route but wanted to build your own, then Hackintoshing is a really interesting option because once you get it to run, it actually runs really stable. I've now run this machine for half a year and I've had no issues really. There are a few quirks obviously since it's not a real Mac, but once you get those sorted, it actually runs super stable, it's super reliable, and the machine I have here is super powerful too. After Apple's big announcement with the architecture change, you might be wondering whether Hackintoshing actually has a future. And the answer is probably yes and no. Yes, because right now there are still Intel Macs being sold. From the previous architecture change that Apple had, which was PowerPC to Intel, we already learned that Apple supports their old hardware for quite a while. And with this I mean years. It was, I think, 5 years. And with that in mind, you can safely build a Hackintosh right now and it's gonna be fine. There are gonna be updates for at least another 5 years, I'm suspecting. And 5 years is practically an eternity in computer hardware terms. So if in 5 years you have to upgrade because Apple dropped support for their Intel Macs, that's not the end of the world, because by then you're gonna want to upgrade anyway. If you've thought about Hackintoshing in the past but weren't really sure yet and you're maybe waiting for something, it's basically now or never, because the longer you wait, the less it will make sense. Right now, Hackintoshing is a really great idea still. It might not be in a couple of years or in 3 years or something like that, unless you're using old hardware and you're prepared to work with older operating systems. Personally, I'm working with an older operating system anyway, so for me it's same difference. So what do you actually need to build a Hackintosh? A Hackintosh is basically just a PC that thinks that it's a Mac. So what's the difference between a PC and a Mac? A PC has a standard architecture where you can put different parts together, and Windows will have the drivers for all the different parts that are out there. Sometimes that is a good thing because you can just swap out things as you want and try out new things and new components. But the drivers sometimes, well actually often lead to problems because they are not always compatible with each other. So you might have components in a system that are incompatible with each other and then create problems in Windows. And then you get a lot of crashes and blue screens and all of the fun things that Windows does. So Macs are different in that respect. Back in the olden days when I got my first Mac, Mac still had a different architecture, which was PowerPC. And that used to be the big difference. Back in those days you couldn't just install macOS on a PC, but at some point Apple decided to switch to Intel 2 like PCs, and at that point you could start installing macOS on PCs because the architecture was compatible. However, the Mac restricts very much the components that you can use within the system, so that the driver issues that I described with Windows don't really appear. They choose very carefully which components go in there, and the operating system is only compatible with those. This also means that they might discontinue support for one type of hardware, change manufacturers of graphics cards. They switch from Nvidia to AMD for graphics cards at some point, making the Nvidia cards incompatible. And well, it's not that hardware incompatibility issues don't exist with Macs, they're actually very common. But they choose the hardware, and you can only use the hardware that Apple uses, or else you can't really install macOS. So, to have a PC that thinks it's a Mac, it has to have the right components in there, the right hardware, so that this actually works and macOS has the driver support. So the first thing you need to do to build a Hackintosh is choose very carefully which components go into your system, and you have to research each and every one of these components to make sure that they are completely compatible. If you don't do that, you're gonna run into problems. So this is actually a really important step, and you can't really, just copy a list of someone and expect it to work. You actually have to know a little bit about what you're doing. In most Hackintosh videos, you're probably gonna see a lot of random parts list of things that other people need for their system. This might not apply to you, so in this video I'm gonna go a bit more general and describe exactly how to choose the parts so that you can make your own list with your own requirements. Pretty much all computers, no matter whether it's a PC or Mac, have several components in common, and it's good to know which ones these are so that you know what goes into a computer if you don't know already. So I'm keeping this very simple. If you know all this stuff and just want to know my parts list, you can just look in the description, it's all there for you. But if you want the long version and how to choose these parts, then this is going to be interesting for you. So computers need a processor, they need a working memory, a permanent memory, some kind of storage. They need some sort of component to show graphics on a display. This could be part of the central processing unit, the CPU, but it can also be a graphics card. And they also need something that connects all these parts together, and that's the main board. The main board might have all sorts of different functions, like there might be a sound card on there, there might be different interface options for storage, like SSD drives or hard drives or extension cards. And mainboard basically just interfaces all of these components and lets them talk to each other. It's pretty much Lego, just with electronics. All the parts are interchangeable and you can all plug them together, but of course the operating system has to know how to interface them, and that's the tricky part with macOS. Before we talk about the components that go into the system, I would first like to talk about the cooling issues, since these were the main reason why I wanted to get a Hackintosh in the first place. Macs just run way too hot, at least the Intel Macs, and that was something that needed to be addressed. The issue isn't as much with Apple as with the processors that Intel produces that run really, really hot. Instead of the really tight squeeze design that looks very sleek that Apple uses, I decided to go with a MIDI case that is really good for airflow. It's a Phanteks P600S. The S means it's a silent version. It has panels that can be removed, and these panels are soundproofed. So when the case is closed, there's not as much airflow, but it's quieter. And for performance, you can take off these panels and then it's really good for airflow. It's kind of a double use case scenario where it's both quiet and has good airflow, and that really appealed to me. I also decided to go with the beefiest air cooler that I could find for the CPU. It's the Noctua D15S. I got the S version because this is the one that is compatible with my mainboard. There's another version of this cooler called D15 and it comes with 2 fans, and originally I wanted that, but only after ordering it I realized that it was actually a bit too big for my mainboard and I needed the asymmetrical version, the D15S, to make it fit with the mainboard and the RAM I had on there. You actually have to be careful with that because not every cooler fits with each mainboard and with each case. You have to check the dimensions and make sure you order the right one. I didn't, and I needed to change the order and send emails around and all that hassle. So yeah, avoid that. I then also exchanged the fans that came with the case, not because they're bad or anything, it's actually because I wanted to have more silent fans. The Phanteks fans are actually quite alright with temperatures, it's just that they're not extremely quiet. So I went with Be Quiet fans instead, and they make it so that the computer is pretty much extremely silent when it's not under full load. And even under full load, it's a very pleasant sound, they're big and not very annoying. I make music, so I need quiet sometimes, and that's one of my requirements. You don't really have to go with the really quiet fans if you don't want to. I did some temperature testing on the windows to determine the right configuration of fans, and in the end I settled on 3 fans in the front, 1 in the back and 1 in the top right above the CPU cooler, and this was the best combination I could find. I also tried 2 fans at the top, but this just siphoned off too much air before it even reached the CPU. After I had determined that, I did some stability testing in Prime 95 and AIDA 64. Prime 95, it passes with 75 degrees, and that's very good. I'm very happy with that temperature. The AIDA 64 is getting a bit too hot with 83, but since this is not a real world scenario, I can definitely live with it. Even the heaviest games shouldn't tax the processor this much, and the games that I play normally are not quite as heavy. Normally I just play multiplayer online games and they're not usually that heavy on the hardware. I then also tested my real-world scenario of video editing and video exporting, and with exporting it only just reaches 66 degrees, which is amazing, especially when you compare it to the MacBook Pro, which gets to 100 degrees. For reference, Intel processors start to throttle at around 105, so since this machine never reaches such high temperatures, it never throttles, and therefore it will have great performance too. But I will cover that in a future video where I will share all my benchmarks of this machine. So I would say the problem of cooling is solved with this configuration, and I'm very happy with the temperatures I got, and this machine will last a very long time with these temperatures. One of the most important decisions is which CPU to choose, and in the PC world you have pretty much two options, which is Intel and AMD. There are some more options, but most people use either Intel or AMD. In the Mac world we only have Intel because that's who Apple chose to work with. Installing macOS on an AMD processor is possible, but you might run into compatibility issues with certain apps. I've certainly heard about issues with stability sometimes, or that certain apps don't run because they use processor functions that are not available on AMD, but you can nowadays install on AMD too. It's the cheaper option, but it's also the more complicated option, and you might run into more problems, so I wouldn't really recommend it if you have no idea what's going on in this video. Intel is the most compatible option, and that's also what I chose because I just didn't want the hassle of dealing with any of the issues of compatibility. I have enough of that just by using macOS sometimes. So Intel it was for me. I decided to go for an i99K, and this is a really beefy processor. It has lots of cores, lots of threads, and for most people it would be overkill. The reason why I chose this one is because I use my computer for video editing. I need a fast processor mainly for converting raw footage on a Canon to DNG, and that uses the CPU and not the graphics card. So it was important for me to have a fast CPU in my Hackintosh. Now the next component I mentioned was working memory or RAM. In this case, of course, faster RAM is always better and more is always better, especially if you do things like video editing. You really need a lot of RAM for that. But the main thing you have to keep in mind is that the RAM has to be compatible with your main board. There are usually lists of compatible RAM on the manufacturer's website of each main board, so you have to check those and make sure that the RAM is compatible. If it's not, you might run into stability issues, and this is not even the problem with macOS, it's just plain mainboard issues. You don't want that, so make sure you check the lists. Get as much as you can afford, because this is something that you can never have enough of. Basically, RAM you always run out, and this is one of the things that makes your computer last a lot longer. It's not something you should cut corners on. Don't buy incompatible RAM just because it's cheaper, and also try to get as much as possible. Another really important thing is the choice of graphics cards. You need to make sure that they're compatible with macOS. You can use the integrated graphics on Intel chips, and that works quite well. I personally chose to go with a graphics card, which is an RX 580. And you might be wondering why I chose such a beefy processor and such a, old graphics card. This is actually due to operating system incompatibilities again. So macOS only supports AMD graphics cards at the moment, and which graphics cards are supported depends very much on the version of macOS that you want to use. Since I need 32-bit support, I need an older version of macOS, in this case Mojave, and this one only supports the RX 580 in the consumer bracket of graphics cards. The RX 5700 is only supported by Catalina, and that only supports 64-bit, so it's not an option for me. And also, just because it's an AMD graphics card and it says RX 580 doesn't necessarily mean that it's compatible, because there are third-party manufacturers that make AMD style graphics cards, like for example Sapphire or MSI or one of these, and not all of them are compatible with Hackintoshing. Some lead to kernel panics, and the best choice is to look at the lists before you buy anything. In my case, it's a Sapphire Pulse RX 580, and I'm happy with that one. It works really well. If you don't need 32-bit applications, you can also get a newer graphics card. Well, if you can get one. After all, we're living through a chip shortage, and an older graphics card is actually probably the only thing you're gonna get. And I have to say that the RX 580 really surprised me, because it can actually run 6K B-RAW footage. So it's actually a lot more powerful than I thought. I thought I would run into problems with B-RAW footage, maybe, and I'm having no issues whatsoever. It's really good for the camera that I use now, which is not a Blackmagic camera. I shoot a Canon at the moment, an older model, and I don't really need B-RAW at the moment, but I wanted to keep it upgradable. So I tested the Hackintosh with footage I got from a really nice guy called Zeke. He makes really cool videos about the Canon EOS M, and that's the camera that I use, so that's why I follow his channel. And he also has a Blackmagic camera, and he supplied me with footage that I could use to test the Hackintosh, and it runs really well. So thanks again to Zeke for the test footage. I'm really happy that I could confirm that the RX 580 is actually a really powerful graphics card considering how old it is. It's a very good graphics card if you want to edit video on a budget. So now we also need to talk about disks. You need to have some sort of drive to put your operating system on. And there are several different options depending on whether you want to only install macOS or whether you want to install Windows 2. If you do want to have Windows 2, I would suggest that you go with a SATA SSD drive for each operating system. You can't put them on the same disk. I repeat this, I stress this. You can't put them on the same disk. If you do, it will be chaos. You will lose your bootloader all the time because Windows overrides the bootloader willy-nilly with each update. So don't do that. Put them on separate disks, and best practice is that while you install an operating system for the first time, you need to disconnect the other hard drive, or there might be confusions. So be careful with that. If you don't need dual boot, you can go with the faster NVMe drives, but I have to tell you that in actual use there's no difference between NVMe and SSD. This only makes a difference if you copy a lot of really large files like video files. So my configuration has 2 SATA SSD drives for the operating system. I have an additional SSD as a backup for macOS. It's smaller and I don't have it connected. I keep it in the case, but it's just a backup drive in case I want to make an update, and that's important. If you make updates, sometimes things go wrong and you need a bootable backup, or you might not be able to recover your system. Now for me, the Windows drive is also a smaller drive. The macOS is on a 1 terabyte SSD and Windows is on a 256 megabyte on a 256 gigabyte SSD, and that's enough for me because I keep my games on an NVMe drive. So the NVMe drive that I use is a P1. might want to say, wait a minute, that's one of the slower options, right? These are the ones that slow down if you write too much to them. But frankly, I only ran into this problem when I used very, 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 very big video files like DNxHR. If you don't need the really super high quality, huge files like that, then you can use any NVMe, also this supposedly slower one. I chose this one to save money, obviously, because I was buying 3 drives at the same time. I use it as a video scratch drive. I keep all my footage on there when I'm editing, and that's my configuration. I also have an actual hard drive in there, like one of the magnetic ones, the old ones, and that's a really good option for storage if you don't need to edit directly off it. You just keep your files on there and you keep it in the computer and it's always connected. And this solves some of the issues that you might run into if you run your memory very fast, because then sometimes macOS doesn't eject the disks gracefully, and that can eventually cause problems with external hard drives. Now the last component that goes in the computer is, in this case, a Wi-Fi and Bluetooth card, because the chip that is on my main board, and I'll come to that in a moment, is not compatible. The Bluetooth Wi-Fi card that I use that is compatible with macOS is a Fenway card, and this actually works really well. I've had no problems with it. The Wi-Fi is connected automatically. For the Bluetooth to be recognized, you have to make sure your USB ports are mapped correctly, but once that happens, it acts exactly like the Bluetooth on any normal macOS. Now, to make all these components talk to each other, we still need a motherboard. And for this, there are many, many different options that you can choose from. I suggest that you check the forums for it. Most importantly, you want to have a mainboard that has all the functions that you might need. I wanted to have proper Thunderbolt support because I make music and a lot of audio interfaces use Thunderbolt, so this was important to me. But if you don't need that, you don't need to choose a very expensive motherboard either. There are many cheaper options than what I chose, and they work really well too. My suggestion would be to look at the forums and look for something called Golden Build or Successful Builds or something like this, and look for a board in your price range that has all your functions. Now the board that I chose, it's a Gigabyte Designer Z390, which is compatible with the processor, and this is something that you have to check. Depending on the processor, you might need a different motherboard. So this is a compatibility issue that has nothing to do with Macs, it's a PC thing. You just have to make sure that it has the right socket and the right chipset for the processor that you want to use. The motherboard is actually the most important part of a Hackintosh build. If this is not compatible, you will not get your Hackintosh to work. All the other stuff might be compatible, but if the motherboard's not compatible, you're out of luck. Even if you have older hardware lying around and maybe an old computer with an old motherboard, this might be a part where you have to spend some money and change it out. But luckily, PC motherboards are not very expensive, unlike logic boards, so there are lots of good and cheap options that are compatible with Hackintosh, and you just have to check the lists. With all of these components, it's really, really important that you check all the compatibility issues that you might run into. You have to check the lists, the new lists, current lists. Don't go with old videos. Don't go with lists from other people that might have worked 5 years ago. They might not work now. You have to check the lists now and go by them. So what I showed you here in parts works really well for me and might work well for a lot of other people, but you need to check that it actually works for your purposes and for what you have in mind. Maybe now it's also time to address the rainbow elephant in the room. RGB, you don't need it. It is completely superfluous, but it makes me personally happy. So yeah, I I decided to go with the RGB stuff. There was already RGB on the main board itself, not very sophisticated, but a little bit. And then the RAM that I ordered was also accidentally RGB because it was actually cheaper that way. And since I already had RGB in there anyway, I decided that the fans could also be RGB. In this case, these are actually fan shrouds and the fans aren't RGB. I added those later on, and they can be controlled via an Arduino controller that I programmed. I used some code that someone else wrote and then built a macOS application around it so that I could also control the fans under macOS. And that's one of the issues with RGB. None of this stuff is compatible with macOS pretty much. There's some open source stuff that works for very few things, like some peripherals, a mouse or keyboard or something like this, but nothing that actually controls the RGB in the computer itself. If you want to control the RGB stuff, you will have to install Windows. You can't set it in Parallels or on any virtual machine. It has to be natively running, which is super annoying. But this is the price you pay, basically. And if you don't want the RGB, you can just install the Windows once, deactivate all the RGB, and then it retains the settings if you do it right. Both the main board that I chose and the RAM that I chose both retain the settings, so those are a good choice also if you don't want RGB. We're now at a point where you have to pay extra if you don't want RGB, so it's just something that PC builders always do. And I personally like it. I know it might not be everyone's taste. If you don't want all that disco stuff in your computer, then, well, you can turn it off. But personally, it makes me happy. And I think these days we should hold on to everything that makes us happy, right? If you're interested in the Arduino RGB controller, I'm gonna make a video about that too, and I'm gonna share the code at that point. So that's gonna be one of the videos of this series. Now, after all the components that go in the Hackintosh, we still need a power supply. For a power supply, best go to one of those power supply calculators. You just put in all the components in your system and it will tell you how much power it needs. And with that, you can choose a power supply. I chose an EVGA Supernova power supply, 850 watts, which is, as always, overkill. I don't think I've ever seen a computer video where they didn't choose a power supply that was complete overkill. It's just something that we do in case we want to upgrade. I was thinking that maybe one day I might have 2 graphics cards in there. I was being optimistic. And this was before the chip shortage, so probably not gonna happen in the next couple of years. But yes, I thought that maybe I could have 2 graphics cards in there, and then I will need a beefy power supply. Why I went with the EVGA one is because it actually has a switch on it that makes it completely silent. It's an eco mode. I make music, so when I record, I need to have quiet, and I record with the computer, so I need to have the computer be quiet. I normally leave the eco mode off because it has very odd fan curves, but it's really handy for when I'm recording, and then the computer is really completely silent. So it's a cool power supply in that regard. So now you have all the parts. You've checked all the lists, you've ordered everything, you've managed to dodge the scalpers and got all the parts even though we're going through a chip shortage. What now? You've never built a PC, how do you go ahead and build one? Well, I'm not really the person to tell you how to build a PC. There are many computer channels out there that have build guides that go into a lot of detail. They go step by step and they show you exactly how it's done. First things first, it's simple. You can't really plug in the things in the wrong parts, it won't fit. So it's straightforward, you don't have to be afraid. Just make sure that you take good care of your components. Don't knock them about, don't drop them, and be especially careful with your CPU. Sometimes they have pins on them that can be bent, So be careful with that. And something that a lot of people forget to do, and a lot of people don't really mention on those PC channels, is that you should ground yourself. Please use one of these anti-static wristbands. They're a hassle to use, but they help. If you've fried a chip by just being statically loaded before, it's gonna be really painful if you fry your CPU that way. Please be careful with that. Now to recap, please choose your parts carefully. Check all the lists, check the forums, do your research. This is an important stage of the Hackintoshing process and you will learn a lot. Don't skimp on things that might be incompatible. It's just gonna make you very sad when it doesn't work, and it's gonna create a lot of frustration if you have almost the right parts but one is wrong. So please choose carefully. When you build the computer, which is really not that hard, use an anti-static wristband and then really almost nothing can go wrong. I think this can be done by someone who doesn't know a lot about computers but is willing to learn. If you do your research, anyone can build a Hackintosh, and I think it's a really nice way also of learning about computers if you don't know about them yet. If you've just been a Mac user for many years and relied on Apple Genius support, then you know how frustrating that can be. It's a lot more rewarding when you can repair your computer yourself, and it's also very helpful when you can just replace a part that is broken through wear or whatever, and it's not the end of the world when this happens. Unlike with a real Mac, where you have a broken logic board and a new one might cost as much as a whole new Mac. So now we have the computer, it's all built, but we still need to install the operating system. However, I will talk about that in the next video, because that's a whole different issue and creates all sorts of other problems, and it's a lengthy process that needs patience, so best it's left for another day. So we will cover the installation in the next video, and then I will go into more detail. It's not going to be a step-by-step guide, I say that up front. It's going to be an overview, just like this one is. I'm going to show you exactly what you need to do to install macOS, and then you can decide whether this whole process is even for you. That video is going to come very soon, and maybe it's even out already. If it is, I'm going to link it in a card up there. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. It really helps out the channel, so I would appreciate it. You can also support what I do on Ko-fi, and this keeps the channel running, so I appreciate each and every one of you who has supported me in the past or will do so in the future. You can expect more videos like this one, at least a few of them about this Hackintosh I built, and there are also more DIY things I do. For example, I do music DIY builds, and I've also done photography related DIY builds in the past. Other than that, I make photography and music videos, and if you're into that sort of thing or anything creative, then you're in the right spot, and I would be happy to have you here. Well, I hope I see you soon for another video. Bye! There are usually lists on the manufacturer homepage. It is now 1999. Jesus. I need to record sometimes, and it has to be quiet. Unlike the background here. Test. Please make it stop. I'm saying the same things 10 times. I'm saying the same things 10 times.